Japan is undergoing a complete military revolution, and no one is paying attention.
For nearly 80 years, Japan has lived under one of the strictest military constitutions on Earth. No offensive weapons, no power projection, no aircraft carriers. That was the deal the country made with itself after 1945, and it kept that promise for generations. But right now, in the waters of the Pacific, a warship is sailing under a Japanese flag that looks, moves, and fights like something the post-war constitution was written specifically to prevent. Japan says it isn't an aircraft carrier. Almost everyone else looking at it disagrees. This is a story of how a helicopter destroyer quietly became one of the most consequential warships in the Indo-Pacific, and why the line Japan drew for itself nearly a century ago is starting to blur. To understand why this ship is such a big deal, you have to go back to 1947, when Japan's post-war constitution took effect. Article 9 of that document is famous or infamous, depending on who you ask. It states that Japan renounces war as a sovereign right and will not maintain land, sea, or air forces with war potential. For decades, Japanese governments interpreted this narrowly but consistently. The country could defend itself, but it could not build the tools of offense. No long-range bombers, no nuclear arsenal, no intercontinental missiles, and critically, no aircraft carriers, because a carrier is fundamentally a power projection tool. It doesn't defend a coastline. It carries war to somewhere else. So Japan's Navy, officially called a Maritime Self-Defense Force rather than a Navy at all, built destroyers, submarines, and helicopter carriers, but nothing that looked like the flat-top strike carriers used by the United States or, more recently, China. There's a deeper historical reason this restriction mattered so much. Japan didn't just dabble in carrier warfare in the 20th century. It essentially invented modern carrier doctrine. Before World War II, most navies still thought of aircraft carriers as scouts or support vessels tucked in behind battleships. Japan's Imperial Navy was the first to mass multiple carriers into a single strike force, capable of launching devastating coordinated air raids. That doctrine produced the Kido Butai, the carrier strike group that executed the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So when modern Japan avoided building carriers after the war, it wasn't just about legal technicalities. It was a deliberate, symbolic renunciation of the exact capability that had once made Japan one of the most feared naval powers in history. That's what makes the last decade so remarkable. In 2015, Japan commissioned a new class of warship called the Izumo-class, named after the lead vessel JS Izumo. Its sister ship, JS Kaga, followed shortly after. Officially, these were helicopter destroyers built to hunt submarines, support disaster relief, and serve as flagships for naval task groups. On paper, completely defensive, but naval analysts noticed something odd almost immediately. These helicopter destroyers had flat, uninterrupted flight decks running nearly the entire length of the hull. They looked less like the helicopter carriers Japan had operated before, and more like scaled-down versions of American amphibious assault ships, vessels that, with a few modifications, are perfectly capable of launching fighter jets. Critics in the region, China in particular, openly called the Izumo-class carriers in disguise. Japan denied it. For a few years, that denial held. Then in 2018, the story changed. The Japanese cabinet approved a plan to convert both the Izumo and the Kaga so they could operate fixed-wing fighter aircraft. Almost overnight, the ships that had always been just helicopter destroyers became something else entirely. And the more people looked into how easily that conversion happened, the more it became clear the ships had likely been designed with this exact future in mind from the very beginning. The deck coatings, the elevator sizing, the internal layout, all of it turned out to be far more compatible with fighter operations than any helicopter carrier would ever need to be. Whether that was foresight or coincidence is something Japan has never fully clarified, but the timeline speaks for itself. A nation that spent 70 years refusing to build anything resembling a carrier suddenly had two ships that needed only modest structural work to become exactly that. So what actually changed? The heart of the conversion involves three things: the deck, the jets, and the classification. Start with the deck. Unlike traditional aircraft carriers, the Izumo-class doesn't use a catapult system or a ski jump ramp to launch planes. Both of those are normally essential for fixed-wing carrier operations because they help aircraft build enough speed to take off from a limited runway. Instead, Japan's approach relies entirely on aircraft that don't need a running start at all. The reinforced decks were fitted with heat-resistant coatings strong enough to withstand the extreme downward thrust of vertical landings, something a standard steel deck would warp or scorch under repeated use. The bow shape was also reworked, moving from a rounded, turbulence-prone design better suited to helicopters toward a squared-off shape that reduces air disruption for jet operations and opens up more usable deck space. That brings us to the aircraft itself. Japan chose the F-35B, the short takeoff, vertical landing variant of the Lockheed Martin F-35 family, originally developed for the U.S. Marine Corps and the Royal Navy. Unlike a standard fighter, the F-35B uses a rotating rear nozzle and a dedicated lift fan to generate enough downward thrust to land almost straight down, and can take off using only a short run rather than a full-length runway. That's exactly the kind of aircraft a modestly sized deck, like the Izumos, can support without ever needing a catapult. Japan is committed to acquiring dozens of these aircraft over the coming years, a purchase that only makes sense in the context of operating them from carriers at sea. And then there's the classification question, which is really where the political maneuvering comes in. Officially, the Izumo and Kaga are still not called aircraft carriers by the Japanese government. They're described as multi-purpose operation destroyers, a label that lets Japan sidestep the constitutional weight that the words aircraft carrier would carry domestically and internationally. It's a distinction that matters more diplomatically than practically. A ship capable of launching and recovering fixed-wing fighter jets functions as a carrier regardless of what its paperwork says. Japan's government has leaned on this technical framing specifically to avoid the kind of political backlash that a sudden, explicit shift toward offensive naval doctrine would trigger both at home and across the region. None of this is happening in a vacuum. Japan didn't wake up one day and decide to reinterpret decades of pacifist doctrine for no reason. The driving force behind this shift is the rapidly escalating tension with China, and specifically the situation surrounding Taiwan. China views Taiwan as a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland, by negotiation if possible, by force if necessary. Japan, meanwhile, has deep economic and strategic ties to Taiwan, and has openly stated that a crisis that would represent a direct threat to Japanese security. That position has made Japan a target of increasing Chinese pressure, from trade restrictions to near-constant naval activity in Japanese waters. Japan's Coast Guard and Navy now regularly track Chinese vessels moving through key straits near Japanese territory, sometimes lingering for days. Airspace incursions occur with increasing regularity. The disputed Senkaku Islands, controlled by Japan but claimed by both China and Taiwan, see a nearly continuous Chinese Coast Guard presence testing Japanese resolve. Add to that China's rapid buildup of artificial islands across the South China Sea, several of them equipped with runways and military infrastructure, and you get a picture of a region where naval power projection is quickly becoming the deciding factor in any future confrontation. China already operates multiple large aircraft carriers. Until very recently, Japan operated none. That imbalance alone explains a great deal about why the Izumo-class conversion happened when it did. Geography also leaves Japan with fewer options than most people realize. It's an island nation with no land borders to fall back on for defense in depth. Its air force has limited range before aircraft would need to return to base, and its economy depends heavily on maritime trade routes that pass directly through contested waters. If Japan wants any credible ability to project air power far from its coastline, or to protect the sea lanes its economy depends on, a purely defensive navy without any carrier capability simply isn't enough anymore. The Izumo and Kaga represent Japan's answer to that gap. Mobile, well-defended command platforms that can carry fighter aircraft, coordinate fleet operations, and extend Japan's reach well beyond what its previous helicopter carriers could manage. The ships themselves are formidable even beyond their aviation role. Each vessel stretches over 800 feet long, making them the largest Japanese warships built since the Second World War. They carry advanced radar systems designed to track airborne threats, close-in weapon systems for point defense, and sophisticated command and control suites that let them function as the nerve center of an entire naval task force. In practice, That command function may end up mattering just as much as their ability to launch jets. A modern naval engagement depends heavily on coordination between surface ships, submarine, and aircraft, and the Izumo-class is built to be the platform that ties all of that together in real time. Japan has also used both ships as demonstration platforms, running joint exercises with allied navies to prove the conversion actually works in practice. The Kaga in particular has taken part in trials involving F-35BS from allied forces, testing everything from routine daytime landings to more demanding nighttime operations and maximum payload launches. These exercises serve two purposes at once. They give Japanese crews desperately needed experience, since operating fixed-wing jets from a carrier deck is an entirely different discipline from running a helicopter carrier, and Japan hasn't had a carrier-qualified crew in nearly 80 years. And they give allied nations valuable data on vertical landing operations at a time when several Western navies are reinvesting in exactly that kind of technology after decades of favoring larger, catapult-equipped carriers instead. Training an entirely new generation of carrier-qualified sailors and pilots may end up being the hardest part of this whole transition. Each of these ships requires a crew in a range of 1,000 personnel, many of whom need entirely new skill sets that Japan's Navy simply hasn't needed to teach in generations. Carrier flight deck operations leave almost no room for error, and building that institutional knowledge from scratch takes years, not months. That's part why Japan has leaned so heavily on cooperation with allied forces, particularly the United States, whose Marine Corps has been directly involved in helping train Japanese crews during these joint exercises. China's reaction to all of this has been predictably sharp. Chinese state media have repeatedly framed the Izumo conversion as proof of Japanese remilitarization, and given the history between the two countries during the 20th century, that framing resonates domestically in China regardless of how Japan chooses to label its ships. Whether Japan's shift is a reasonable response to a genuinely more aggressive regional environment, or a step onto a slope that eventually leads somewhere Japan's constitution was designed to prevent, depends entirely on which side of the East China Sea you're standing on. What isn't up for debate is that the ships exist, the jets are being delivered, and the training is already underway. Looking ahead, there are already signs this is only the beginning. Reports suggest Japan is exploring future integration of unmanned combat drones alongside its crewed fighter squadrons, and discussions around next-generation fighter development continue to move forward as part of broader regional defense partnerships. Whether any of that materializes on the timeline currently being discussed remains to be seen, but the trajectory is clear enough. A country that spent nearly 80 years defining itself by what its military could not do is now redefining carefully, deliberately, and through very specific engineering choices what it can do instead. The Izumo and the Kaga aren't just warships. They're a quiet rewriting of the rules Japan set for itself after the Second World War, and the rest of the region is watching every modification closely.